Hello. The purpose of this video is to introduce you to arguments and how they are used in functions. So we will start with a function that should look pretty understandable to you. Here's our function, and it begins with the keyword function, followed by the name of our new function, trip cost, followed by parentheses, one pair of parentheses, which is empty. And then within the curly braces are all the instructions that will run when this function is called. Okay, so the first instruction calculates how many gallons will my trip cost me, or how many gallons will I need, depending on the miles the trip will require and the miles per gallon of my car. The second line will calculate the total money based on the gallons I'm going to use and the price of gasoline, that is the current price. And finally, the third step will pop an alert that tells us how much will the car trip cost me. Okay? And finally, we would have to call the function in order to make it run. And that's all here. Okay? So everything here should be understandable. Something's missing. The numbers, right? So we don't know what the price of gas is, and so on and so forth. So how would we get those numbers into this function? One way would be to add some variables, right? So we would provide the price, and we would provide the miles that our trip is, and we would provide the miles per gallon of our car. And if we run this, we will see an alert that pops up, and it says our trip is going to cost us $9.94 and a lot of extra decimal places. Okay, now what could we do instead of having fixed prices that we would have to go in and type and change every time, which somebody using an application wouldn't know how to do, right? They don't have access to the program. So in order to make this more flexible and interactive, we could replace those fixed variables with prompts that asked for new numbers, right? So we could have three prompts getting what is the current price of gas, how many miles is this trip, and what's the miles per gallon for your current car. So if we run that, we will get a pop-up that asks the price per gallon. So let's say it was highish for now, $2.95. How many miles? Let's say we're going 200 miles. And miles per gallon, let's say 38. And finally, I get this trip will cost me $15.52 and a lot of decimal places. There's a way to get rid of those, not in today's lesson. Okay, what does this have to do with arguments? Currently, nothing. We haven't used any arguments yet because arguments go inside the parentheses and then are used in the function itself. All right, so what goes inside the parentheses? Parentheses can stay empty. That's still valid for certain functions. The function may require one argument. It may require two, three. It may require a lot. It may require an entire array. So those parentheses are very flexible. You can feed in whatever the function needs to run. This is empty, this parentheses, when we first define this function. So every time we call this function, that has to be empty. The parentheses will be empty. But what if we've got in here price and miles and MPG? Then what happens when we call the function? We actually have to feed it some kind of information. So I'm going to feed it simply 3 ones. Not really valid for our car trip, but to show you that this function that you already saw run once, it's going to run differently this time. So I will feed in similar information to the last time. How many miles? 200 miles per gallon, maybe 28. So I should get some number up around 10 or 15 like I did before, right? Wrong. It says this trip will cost $1. And why is that? So look at what happened when we called this function. When we called it, we passed in 3 numbers. And so when it ran, it put a 1 in here. It put a 1 in here, and it put a 1 in here. This function completely ignored this and this and this because it accepted what we gave it as arguments when we called it. So this is the way that arguments work. And so we can actually get rid of this altogether. But instead of doing that, I'm going to do something else altogether. I am going to change this variable name to A. I'm going to change this variable name to B, and this one to C. So they no longer match these words, price and miles per gallon. And then I'm going to change these numbers to those variable names, A and B and C. And you can see that A still corresponds to a question about the price of gas. And B still corresponds to a question about how many miles. And C corresponds to the MPG, right? Oh, sorry, the MPG. So if we run it this time, and I put in our similar kinds of numbers, let's say 275, and how many miles? Let's say 500 miles, and per gallon, let's say 31, 32. Okay, this trip will cost $42 and change. So hopefully you can see how arguments are used at the time that the function is called. But in order for things in the parentheses to have any validity, they have to correspond in number and even in data type to what is being asked for. What is being asked for when the function is defined, these words or letters or variable names or whatever have to appear in the same format within the function because they're used within the function in this way. It doesn't matter what they're called outside the function. That makes no difference at all. And for one last demo, I can get rid of all our variables, and I can make these more realistic numbers, like 2.8 for the cost of gas, and miles, say 600, and my miles per gallon, say they're pretty good, 42, and if I run this, I will now find I have a $40 trip. So arguments, very commonly used in all the programs written by other people that you're going to be looking at in the future. Very flexible, very important to writing functions properly.